Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to the Politforum Bern and to our live stream on YouTube. My name is Rebecca. I work here at the Politforum, and I will be your moderator tonight. The Politforum Bern is a place where current political issues are critically discussed and made accessible to the public. Our goal is to create a space where complex topics like foreign influence and human rights can be examined from different perspectives. Tonight's conversations, which we are hosting with the Society for Threatened People Switzerland, is part of that mission, to connect political developments at the national and international level with the lived experiences of people in Switzerland. Everyone here brings different perspectives, and that's exactly why we're here. We're here to listen, to weigh arguments, and to contribute our own viewpoints and experiences. For us, exchanges like these are vital for a healthy democracy, and they rely on mutual respect. So after about an hour, we will open the floor to you. First, we'll discuss with our guests here, but then we really want to hear your viewpoints, to share your thoughts and ask questions. And if you are joining us online, you can also ask questions via the YouTube chat or Slido, where you don't need to be signed in. Please note that the entire event is being filmed for YouTube and will also remain available online after the discussion. But I want to inform you that the audience is not being filmed or photographed. So you're fine. You are not fine, but you're fine. And what I also want to note is we kindly ask you to not take any pictures or film the event. Before we start into the with the topic, I quickly want to show you a very short video. I hope. Okay.
Landsleiter und sehr verehrte meine Damen und Herren, liebe Freunde, alle einen schönen guten Abend.
Excuse me. Just some technical difficulties. I apologize. It's okay. No. Perfect.
又逢中秋月圆时，很高兴我们能有机会再次在巴塞尔相聚，共庆中秋节。
Schön wieder zu einer Vormondszeit im Mitte Herbst. Ich freue mich sehr, dass wir uns wieder in Basel getroffen sind und wir feiern gemeinsam das Mondfest.
首先，请允许我对巴塞尔中秋节活动的举办表示热烈的祝贺，并向各位同胞、各位侨胞和瑞士朋友们致诚挚的节日的祝福。
Zunächst meine herzliche Gratulation zur heutigen Veranstaltung und ich wünsche alles Gute für alle Anwesenden, alle chinesische und schweizerische Freunde. Alles Gute zum Mondfest.
You have just watched a short video documenting an incident at the Moon Festival, a festival in which Basel and Shanghai are celebrating their partnership. Chinese security personnel confronted and intimidated demonstrators, seizing also Tibetan flags. It offers an insight into the kind of fear and pressure Tibetan and Uyghur people experience, not only in China, but even here in democratic countries like Switzerland. We wanted to begin this way because tonight's conversation is about these lived experiences, the stories behind the headlines, and how repression can reach far beyond borders. We're glad to have you here for this timely and important roundtable discussion on transnational repression by the People's Republic of China and how it affects communities right here in Switzerland, particularly Tibetans and Uyghurs living here. But to understand today's discussion, it is helpful to look briefly at the historical context. Since the 1950s, after China annexed Tibet and began intervening heavily in Tibetan society, Tibetans have fled repression and settled in countries like Switzerland. In 1960, Switzerland became one of the first Western countries to accept Tibetan refugees. And today it remains home to one of the largest Tibetan diasporas in Europe, with approximately 8,000 people living here, many of whom continue to advocate for Tibetan rights in exile. Uyghurs are a Muslim ethnic minority, primarily living in the province of Xinjiang in Western China. The repression of Uyghur language, religion, and identity began in the 1950s, and it intensified especially after 2009, following the Urumqi unrest, when ethnic tensions between Uyghurs and Han Chinese erupted into violent clashes, leaving nearly 200 people dead. Since then, the Chinese government has enforced a policy of mass surveillance and crackdowns. Uyghurs began arriving in Switzerland in greater numbers in the 1990s and 2000s, fleeing political and religious persecution. And in recent years, China has not only tightened restrictions in Tibet and Xinjiang, but increasingly sought to control diaspora communities abroad through surveillance, harassment, and intimidation. These methods are now collectively referred to as transnational repression and are being used by other authoritarian governments as well. Over the past decades, scholars and human rights organizations have documented China's systematic and growing efforts to monitor and influence its diaspora communities worldwide. Switzerland is one of the first countries to officially recognize this phenomenon. This year, the Federal Council published a report based on an academic study clearly stating that China engages in intimidation, harassment, and the surveillance of diaspora members within Swiss borders. To help us frame this conversation, I'd like to give now the floor to Anna Leising. She's the director of the Society for Threatened Peoples in Switzerland. Her organization has worked closely with policymakers and diaspora communities to bring public attention and political focus to this issue.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. A warm welcome also from my side to this discussion. My name is Anna. I'm very happy that we are so many here gathered to discuss this very relevant and timely issue of transnational repression. And I say it's relevant not only because it targets specific human rights, civil, political, cultural rights of individuals and communities, but it actually undermines the very globally agreed ground rules that we have, such as multilateral and democratic institutions, such as human rights, such as the rule of law. And as a human rights organization, which we are, we support the rights of indigenous communities and minoritized groups in different regions of the world. And we have, in recent years, and even more so in recent months, become very much aware how fragile these ground rules are, as authoritarian tendencies are on the rise again. The spread of nationalist ideologies, wars, state repression, and the dismantling of democratic institutions are undermining basic human rights, and the people who stand up for human rights are being criminalized, persecuted, and silenced. Multilateralism, which has contributed to securing peace and human rights for decades, is being increasingly and very rapidly being weakened. As a result, the protection mechanisms for vulnerable groups and human rights defenders are under pressure. And that's why I say it's not only a relevant, but also a very timely discussion. To contribute to the safety, security, and protection of those who defend human rights all over the globe, is one of the main thematic areas that STP, Society for Threatened Peoples, works in. And as Rebecca mentioned, STP has been working on the phenomenon of transnational repression for many years. In collaboration with Tibetan and Uyghur partners, we have been raising awareness and we have been advocating for coherent and consistent policies and strategies towards the People's Republic of China by the Swiss government. In 2018, we have published a report on the situation of the Tibetan diaspora in Switzerland. And as we will see, unfortunately, many of the findings of that report are still relevant today. After that, we have filed a petition that led to a parliamentary motion asking for a thorough analysis of how diaspora communities in Switzerland are targeted by the Chinese government. And while it took much longer than expected, we are very happy to see that this analysis, through the study of the University of Basel and the report from the Federal Council on the phenomenon of transnational repression, has finally been published. Of course, we're not happy about the findings in the report. The situation it describes, the many specific forms of threats and harassment that Tibetans and Uyghurs and allies experience, the way how China undermines basic human rights and the rule of law in China and abroad. We will talk about this tonight, and it is definitely not something to be happy about. However, we are happy that these realities are finally officially recognized, because that helps to further increase awareness and to start looking for solutions. And when I say solutions, I don't want to anticipate the discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing and learning much more from the experts. But I want to mention that beyond the solutions and measures that we can identify to support human rights defenders in terms of their physical, emotional, legal, digital security, or also the measures that we can find to increase the capacities and abilities of Swiss authorities to actually protect those groups, the response to transnational repression must be addressed at the very top global policy level of diplomacy. And that's why we urge, as STP, we urge the Swiss government not to treat transnational repression just as a minor or merely technical issue that can be addressed and discussed behind closed doors and through long bureaucratic processes, but to look at it as a question of upholding very fundamental values, guarantees, and freedoms in the face of increasingly authoritarian, oppressive, and violent powers that are on the rise on the globe. And in the face of these powers, for us, I think it's crucial not to retreat, not to give up, but to come together as we do here tonight and to exchange all our knowledge, our experiences, our perspectives. And thus, I want to thank the Politforum for co-hosting the event with us tonight. I want to thank the team for organizing it, knowing how much effort goes into these kinds of events. I want to thank all of you for coming and be willing to discuss. I want to thank the experts from near and far away. And especially, I want to thank all the Tibetan and Uyghur partners and activists who have been and will be advocating for fundamental human rights. Thank you for your courage and your persistence.
Thank you, Anna. We are joined by our four panelists, each bringing deep expertise, lived experiences, and insights into this discussion. We have Selina Morel. She is Program Manager for China at the Society for Threatened People Switzerland. Her work focuses on China's policies towards Tibetans and Uyghurs. She has advocated for concrete legal and institutional measures to counter transnational repression. Then Tsering Tsomo, she's the research director at the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy, a long-standing human rights defender and expert on transnational repression. She works closely with Tibetan communities across Europe to raise awareness, document abuses, and build resilience against fear and surveillance. She has organized workshops on mental health, digital security, and collective resilience. Then Zumretay Arkin, she's the vice president of the World Uyghur Congress. She has been an advocate for Uyghur rights at the national and international levels. She has spoken at the United Nations, led campaigns to expose the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and worked extensively on documenting the reach of Chinese repression beyond its borders. She herself has faced online harassment and pressure. And then Ralf Weber, he's an associate professor at the University of Basel. He's a political scientist specializing in China's international strategy and has authored research on how the Chinese Communist Party exerts influence abroad. He co-authored the academic study commissioned by the Federal Council that informed the recent report on transnational repression in Switzerland. His work highlights the role of the Chinese United Front Work Department in mobilizing networks abroad. Thank you all for being here tonight. We had also invited representatives from relevant Swiss authorities to join the conversation. Unfortunately, despite our efforts, we were unable to secure a representative for this panel. So this panel explores three key aspects of transnational repression: its forms and effects, the responses by communities and institutions, and the question of political responsibility and protection. We'll ask, how does this pressure show up in people's daily lives? How does China's influence affect the freedoms of those who thought they had escaped repression? What role do Swiss politics and international relations play? And crucially for this last aspect, what can and must be done to protect the rights of all who live here? For each theme or topic, I'll begin with the broad questions that you all can answer, and then I will ask more concrete questions to each of you. And please feel free to respond to each other as well, so that we can make this a conversation. So let's start by setting the scene. When you hear the term transnational repression, what does it mean to you? Tsering Tsomo.
Honestly, I never thought that I would be talking about transnational repression, because for the last 2 decades, I was so used to documenting and monitoring the human rights abuses happening inside Tibet. That was what I was used to. And now we are talking about that repression actually coming outside of Tibet. And all of us are affected in different ways. People's lives are uprooted, and then we also have, intimidation. We are talking about harassment, people receiving phone calls, death threats, and then, when you go to the local police to complain, the police officers are clueless on how to handle these cases. And then you also have the Chinese authorities actually forcing Tibetans inside and outside to cut off connections. So we are talking about families not able to talk to each other for 10, 15 years. We have documented these cases in a report that our organization published last January, so it's quite recent. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah. This should be fine. Okay.
Kann sie sich hang haben? Einen Moment.
Sorry.
So we are talking about, the impacts on real lives, people unable to live their lives, basically. They are in constant climate of fear. They are unable to talk to their family members, and then, lots of distress in the community. You are not able to trust your friends, your neighbor, people you have worked with for so many years. I mean, you are talking about infiltration and co-optation inside the community. So it's really difficult to work in such an environment. So, I don't know how to put into words the severity, the severity and the extent and the scale of this threat that we face. And I think I believe that it is high time that we have to take action, otherwise this is going to expand, and then, one day, we'll not be able to control it, yeah.
For you?
Yeah, I think transnational repression, there are several different, I think, definitions of TNR these days. There's no common definition as of now, but I think there's a common understanding what it is. Essentially, it is intimidation and harassment of diaspora communities, of dissidents, of human rights defenders, journalists, and that's now expanding to also lawmakers, institutions, government officials, and others. And it's essentially to prevent you from speaking, to censor you, to silence you. And it's something that essentially goes hand in hand with fear and anxiety. And it's something that, as you've mentioned in your introduction, Uyghurs and Tibetans, it's now part of our daily life. So wherever we go, whether we're in Switzerland, in Australia, or elsewhere, we just simply don't feel safe. Transnational repression, to put it simply, is I'm a Canadian citizen of Uyghur origin. I just don't feel safe, even here, sitting with you in the space, because I know that I am constantly harassed, monitored online, monitored in person. So that's kind of what it is, basically, which is in a way to prompt me or to prevent me from participating in political activism.
Ralph Weber, based on your research, how have Chinese state actors or their proxies concretely operated in Switzerland?
Yeah, I think generally you could maybe think of that as a sort of transgressive political activities abroad, of which there's a whole bunch, and transnational repression is one of them, right? It's a bigger, I think, phenomenon than transnational repression overall. Transnational repression is something very specific, but it's also very, at the same time, an umbrella term that really brings together a whole bunch of different phenomena, and I think it's really important to illustrate that maybe quickly, right? But transnational repression can mean, putting pressure on people to spy for you, for instance. That's on one end of the spectrum, and for that, usually states have laws. Right, there the infringement in your territory is very obvious, and it's just a matter whether the penal code is applied or not. Right? And then it extends to other forms of being photographed, maybe at a demonstration, of being surveyed by the communication that you're doing, so somebody would read your email, or cyber attacks would harass you through that, right? The whole sort of phenomena again, where sometimes it's not quite clear when a threshold is being met there, and then the penal code might not apply or might apply, right? And then you have a whole bunch of transnational repression phenomena that actually is almost outside the reach of the societies in which it takes place. That's, for instance, if you being photographed at a demonstration, and then in Xinjiang or in Tibet, the family is summoned to the police station, and there's a little conversation in which that photo is being shown, and it's said, maybe your son shouldn't do that, can't you call up the son, right? But now it's taking place in China, right? I mean, formally in China, right? So it's for the Swiss government very hard to do something about that, right? Our laws don't apply in China, right? There's international law that would still apply, but try to enforce that in China, right? Up to things like visa. If you want to go and visit your ailing or aging mother or father for a last time, you need a visa. A visa is entirely in the power of the country to give it or not. But he may say, yeah, you get a visa, but you know, we give and we take, right? And then you might have problematic things happening. So it's an entire range of phenomena, and all of that we call transnational repression. But I think we are not yet very precise in that. And as an academic, we love to be precise about things, right? So it is the term, I think, has two sides, right? It raises it puts the light on something that is really problematic. But it also, it could be more precise because different forms of transnational repression might require different reactions to them.
Selina, how does today's transnational repression connect maybe to earlier waves of repression against Tibetans and Uyghurs? Do you see continuity in the strategy, or has the approach evolved?
I think it has, of course, evolved with the means. The digital means today, they enable it to collect data abroad, and they make it very easy to spy on people far away. You don't need this physical closeness, and that has for sure changed a lot the dynamic of this repressions that you can do over the territories of your country. When it comes to Tibetan and Uyghurs abroad, I think the time around 2008 was very pivotal because there was a lot of violence and instability in Tibet and Xinjiang in East Turkestan happening. A lot of the people were demonstrating, protesting, and that, I think, was a moment when the Chinese government started to be really afraid also how active the diasporas were abroad. They were very loud, very organized, they are very good at doing advocacy work, and this crowd abroad, that is for sure something that the Chinese government already before tried to manage, but in that moment it started to be really a factor that they had to take into much more account and to really start to do very systematic outreach. They did that for sure before already, but this diaspora that is fighting for the rights, human rights of people in China, that is something that is what China doesn't like, and they want to counter it.
Tsering Tsomo, could you give us concrete examples of, just for the people, that we understand what transnational repression in the lives of normal people could look like? Could you give us a concrete example?
So allow me to share with you two cases of transnational repression that we documented in Switzerland for the report. I was actually shocked by the severity of the experiences of the Tibetans in Switzerland. The first one was shared with us by a former Tibetan political prisoner. I quote from the report, in 2021, so this happened in Switzerland, I received a video call from one of my siblings in Tibet. When I picked up the call, I found out that they were calling from the local police station, surrounded by half of our family members, as well as 2 police officers. The police officers asked me to behave well abroad and to refrain from engaging in activities that could go against Chinese policies. Further, I was asked not to instigate my relatives in Tibet in any way, and not to post or share any political content on social media. If I failed to obey, the officers said my relatives would suffer consequences. And now the second testimony. Again, this is a former political prisoner. prisoner who escaped from Tibet in 2014. He served 5 years in prison just for assisting a documentary filmmaker in Tibet. Again, documenting human rights abuses in Tibet. And so he escaped in 2014, and he was able to seek refuge here in Switzerland. So this happened again, very recent, around 2022. There is a park near my house in Zurich where I used to go for evening walks. I often noticed an electronic device flying above me and just assumed it was some children's toy. But in August 2021, as I was leaving the park, that was in August 2021, I noticed the device following me home. It was still there when I reached my doorstep. Concerned, I reached out for my phone to take a picture of that device, and the device instantly flew away. I now realize it was a drone. Until then, I had no idea about drone surveillance. So we have drone surveillance happening here. And the same guy shared with me another experience that happened at Zurich railway station, where he was followed by a Chinese man. It happened for several days because he had to commute in the train in Zurich. So he tried to take a picture of that person, and that person ran away, tried to escape. And somehow he managed to complain to the police, but then the police were clueless. They didn't know how to react. So that's why, awareness about transnational repression among law enforcement agencies, is so important. Otherwise, the people who are targeted by Chinese transnational repression, they remain unprotected. They expect protection from Swiss authorities because they are unable to exercise their basic human rights, to speak out. This same person, he's a monk, a former political prisoner. He was also harassed at the United Nations when he had to, speak at the United Nations sessions. He was followed. His story was published by, Reuters, and then it became a huge story. So you can see that, it's getting more difficult. In fact, for some people, it's now impossible to, be an activist or an advocate for human rights. We are talking about, this inability to exercise basic rights and freedoms, that we should be taking granted in a country like Switzerland.
Thank you. Zumretay Arkin, what kind of emotional strain does this cause for individuals, or maybe more concretely, how does this pressure affect trust between people in the community?
I mean, it has, I think, disastrous consequences on the community, but also the people that you encounter in your daily life, because the Chinese government has long used also this method of using informants within our own community. So over the years, we've found, for example, Tibetan spies, Uyghur spies who were, just like us, but they were collecting information from politically active communities, whether it's in Canada or elsewhere. And that those usually are people that we've encountered very regularly at community events, at political civil events, where they were exposed, or they were they accessed a range of information on community life, political life, and other sensitive information. And so that has allowed people to fear, right? Fear, when fear is in question, people need to protect themselves. It's a very normal first response. And over the years, a lot of the communities, when they started hearing these kind of infiltrators, whether it's Uyghurs or Tibetans, or even sometimes there are Westerners who are, sometimes playing the journalist card, saying, I'm a journalist, I'd like to speak with you. And then we find out later that they were actually spies for the Chinese government. And so when that happens, the community, you start isolating yourself from the community, or at least from the community life, the political, civil, social events. And so that's exactly what the Chinese government or these governments want. It's to weaken the community, it's to isolate you, it's to censor you, so that you're not encouraged to build something, to whether it's a political capital, whether it's advocacy campaigns. They just want you to weaken that kind of community support. And it's, I think, as the Uyghur community that I represent, for us, as a community that is going through extreme trauma over the last few years, I mean, imagine, we've lost contact with our relatives since 2017. I myself have not spoken with my relatives since 2017. And so for us as a collective diaspora, it's a collective trauma. And for us, community life is everything. So when the Chinese government is trying to attack that same community life that is giving us resilience and strength abroad, then you're left with nothing. And I think this is exactly what the government wants. And I think we have a responsibility to do better, to protect our own citizens, because we're as much as, Canadian, Swiss citizens as you are. And I think there's a need for a stronger or bigger solidarity here that we need, because as you said, those examples are very real. Just last week, I came to the office and 3 of us received government-backed attacks on our email servers, and it all came from China. I am followed constantly, for example, at the UN by these Chinese diplomats. The UN is supposed to be, imagine, a space for human rights defenders, a safe space for us, and yet we're confronted with our perpetrators, and they are allowed to take photos of us with no consequences at all. Sometimes our names are handed to the Chinese mission at the request at their request by the UN Secretariat. So for us, these spaces have become less and less accessible and more stressful to be in.
Ralph Weber, from your research, can you add anything about the impact transnational repression has on individuals and community here in Switzerland?
Yeah, I think I can confirm what has been said from the point of view of the research that we've done. But we interviewed many people. We held it against evidence from other accounts, right? And what we also did is we looked also more maybe at the Chinese party state, the different institutions there, and what they say that their task is, right? So if you take all of that together, and I think as academics that's what we should do, right? We came to similar conclusions, and we attributed levels of probability, right? And we said, this sort of transnational repression is occurring in Switzerland with a very high level of probability. Because it's difficult, it's not an easy area to do research in and come to very definite conclusions, right? If these conclusions were there in the evidence, authorities would have an easier life in persecuting, right? But it's gray areas often, and the party state is very, very good in playing that. Right, and I think that's something where we need a bit more of understanding about the mechanisms and the procedures, how the party state, not only in transnational repression, essentially it uses similar methods towards its own population, towards human rights defenders that are non-Tibetan and non-Uigur, right, to Falun Gong, to all sorts of different people it goes after. Right, and the gray zone is really tricky, because the moment we start talking on the stage here and the Federal Council publishes a report about refugee espionage, right? What's the impact of that? I was imagining when I was seeing that in the community, many people will start looking behind themselves, right? And you reinforce what the party state wants you to do. So in a sense, the Communist Party and the People's Republic of China has a lot on its hand, because he can play this in however way it wants. The effect will come across up until it is being confronted, maybe. I'm not sure whether that is the easiest way to go about this, or governments and these target societies react with the means that liberal democracies give to react, right? But it's the phenomenon, I think, is well documented by now, and it's hard to dispute. Yeah.
Tsering Tsomo, you've worked on building awareness and resilience. Could you share examples on what's worked well to strengthen communities?
Yeah, so when we published our report on transnational repression back in January 2024, we followed that up with awareness raising campaigns in the community. We organized workshops. We invited people from the community, especially those who have lived experiences of transnational repression. And we also found, through our research, that it is very important to actually focus on mental health as well, because a lot of times, as we have heard from the experiences of the Uyghurs as well as Tibetans, when you are not allowed to speak to your family for years and years, and distance from your community and isolated, it really, make a mess of your mental health. So and as for me, my personal experience is, when we talk about mental health, I have suffered from vicarious trauma, because I was documenting all these cases, and even if you have not, gone through it yourself, but in some ways you tend to absorb the trauma that your community has experienced. So if it affects, everyone, one of us in the community, so it's not easy. So what we did was that we actually conducted a session on mental health within the workshop in transnational repression, and then we also, visited some countries in Europe, such as Netherlands, France, United Kingdom, to actually, explain to the lawmakers, the parliamentarians, the government authorities, that this is real, the threat that we face is real, and there are people who are affected by this transnational repression, and that, we want you to take action. And since then we have seen some development, some momentum on the issue, but then this is not enough. We have to do more. Yeah.
Selina Morel, in your work with the STP, how well are affected individuals in Switzerland supported, be it emotionally, legally, or institutionally? Are there examples where the system works or where they clearly don't work?
I think it doesn't work so far, but it is also a tricky thing with this, what we call tonight transnational repression. It's not easy to pinpoint and to fight in as a totality, and there are a lot of things already in place, like civil law, for example. We have counter-espionage programs that is already there and addresses a part of the problem. The problem is more if the people are affected by transnational repression, they're very alone in the moment that it happens. And we heard before a case of someone in Switzerland who was confronted with a situation, going to the police, and the police doesn't know what to do. And this must change. The law enforcement agency need to be trained. The government in total needs to define the problem and understand the problem in a total, and then the solutions can also be combined to start fight it very well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You've already talked about new refugees, and I was wondering if Uyghur or Tibetan refugees that arrive today, do they react differently to this pressure or repression than older generation? Maybe Zumretay Arkin.
I think they react almost the same way. So refugees, Uyghur refugees who come here, I would say they were the closest to the repression, because if they left just now from the country, they left because of the political situation. So they were exposed to the reality and the extreme abuses very recently. So in a way, everywhere we've observed in every Uyghur community in the diaspora, Uyghur refugees, when they arrive to their host countries, they take they isolate themselves completely from the community. I mean, it happens that they will, seek for help from the community that's existed or that's been there for a long time, but usually they prefer, at least something that we've observed here in Switzerland, is that they prefer to isolate themselves because they're still not sure if they can trust the Uyghurs who are here, right? It will take time to also observe. That's what I said. The feeling of trust, when it's broken, it's very difficult, and it takes a long time to reestablish that trust. And the paranoia, you're constantly paranoid that your neighbor could be a spy, or you could be deported back. I mean, these Uyghurs don't know what international law looks like, don't know what the principle of non-refoulement looks like, until it is explained to them, and they feel assured that they're not going to be deported tomorrow to China. But yes, everything takes time, and I think it's also the responsibility, the duty of the Uyghur and the Tibetan communities to give them that space to feel safe enough to then come approach us. But of course, right away, it's very difficult for them.
Is that the same for newly arrived Tibetan refugees? Is between the generations? Yes, sure. Is there a difference between the generations of Tibetan refugees, like newly arrived Tibetan refugees? Do they now react differently to the pressure than older generations? Do you have other experience?
Well, I think the new refugees, I think they are definitely more paranoid because they have seen firsthand, what has happened in Tibet, and then they have escaped. So the memory is still fresh in their minds, and the wound is still fresh. So, and then coming here and learning about transnational repression, they actually thought that they had escaped that repression. Mm-hmm. And now they are back to the same situation. So it is a huge shock to them to be in a situation where, you're back to where you thought you escaped from. So that's a difficult position to be in. And it actually, again, it plays a, makes a mess of their mental health. And I have seen it firsthand. And it is really difficult to convince them that, we have, we try to convince them that this is a rule-based, community. It is international community. We have human rights. You try to educate them that this is not Tibet under China. This is where you have the right. But then again, sometimes because of transnational repression, we feel like, we are just bluffing, So yeah, this is really hard. I don't know how to make sense of that. I'm still trying.
So let's now turn to the broader political and economic context and the question of responsibility. So Switzerland signed a free trade agreement with China in 2013, becoming one of the first Western countries to do so. Since then, economic relations have deepened significantly, and influenced by the huge US tariffs recently imposed on China and other countries, it is possible that European countries might even intensify their economic relations with China in the future. And this has obviously come with growing concern, including early warnings by the SDP, as Anna also said, that economic interests may be prioritized at the expense of human rights. These concerns are especially urgent when we consider the safety and protection of vulnerable diaspora communities. So as Switzerland considers the renewal of its free trade agreement with China, how should it navigate this process in the light of the documented cases of transnational repression? Are there specific human rights safeguards or conditions that should be integrated into such negotiations? Zumretay Arkin?
Yeah, absolutely. I've said it many times to the Swiss government that when you're negotiating with a genocide perpetrator, human rights should be front and center of those negotiations. It should not be something, a sub-theme at the end of the discussion when you've negotiated all of the trade, but then you're just, talking about human rights because you want to go to the media and talk about the fact that you've incorporated those thematic issues. So I think, yes, it's very important because we're not talking about human rights violations simply. We're talking about atrocity crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and I mean, there are no graver crimes than these crimes under international law, and these crimes have been documented consistently. And so I think it's very hypocritical for these governments to, in one hand, condemn human rights violations when they have their EU-China, dialogues or Swiss-China dialogues, and then on the other hand, go sign free trade agreements where there's no mention or there's no actual meaningful action on these violations. I think as governments, as especially rule-based governments, democratic governments that respect so-called human rights and international laws, there's a bigger responsibility to prevent these atrocities. And yet we're here when the international community has failed to prevent. We're actually, in the phase of these crimes or of the genocide itself. And we're just still talking about, trade and how can we, exchange with China more diplomatically, more, not lose our economic interests. Yeah, I mean, no one is saying stop the trade, but we're saying if there's no human rights, if those issues are not respected, then maybe you have to rethink your leverage.
What are the expectations of the STP in these negotiations or for renegotiated trade agreement? Do you have certain expectations or certain,
We have mostly fears, and it goes back to the report that Anna mentioned in the introduction that we drafted 2018 with the Tibetan organizations in Switzerland. And there, one of the conclusions was that the closer economic relations between Switzerland and China created more and more the feeling amongst Tibetan and also Uyghur people in Switzerland that there is less support from the Swiss government for their demands. So economic relations matter. They have an effect on the situation and on human rights of people in Switzerland. And now with this report and the study documenting it, it is just a different situation. It is also a different situation because 2014, when the free trade agreement was ratified and entered into force, it was another time. And now 10 years later, 10 years Xi Jinping, there are so much more human rights. The human rights situation is worse, and it cannot just go on like this. And the free trade agreement doesn't have human rights in it. So if Switzerland wants to upgrade it, there's really a need to also think about how do we put human rights in there to protect the people living here, and also how to enforce that. And I think it is high time to do that now, and we have to pressure.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I mean, two things. One is I'm not sure whether the free trade agreement is the right thing to point out to, right? So when we talk about reception of Tibetan refugees in Switzerland, I think they receive a mixed reception also from the community sometimes, right? Which is long established in Switzerland, which looks at these newcomers asking itself, no, they're coming now, right? There's distrust also there. So it goes in both directions, I think. And so there's a longer historical trajectory. So I would say the free trade agreement for me is not the major anchor point. I would rather say it's the 1990s. And then mainly the entry to the WTO, World Trade Organization, when a lot of European and other countries have thought, okay, there's a lot of money to be made with China. The market, the dream, right? The big Chinese market of which everyone was convinced we will get a big piece of the cake, and many did not, right? And will never, maybe. But that was the conviction. And in that times, I think many countries started compromising on principles, and these are constitutionally guaranteed principles. And it's not just human rights, I think, that we're talking about. We might talk about human rights violations in Tibet and in Xinjiang, right? But when it goes to our own societies, the values we're talking about are human rights, yes, but in the form of fundamental rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. It's about democracy that one believes in, right? It's about the rule of law, which is fundamental, and the fundamental difference to the People's Republic of China, where there's no rule of law, right? So these are the values one talks about, and sometimes I find it's better to communicate if one wants to frame this, and one easily gets into a frame of business versus human rights. And then the fronts are very clear, right? And I'm not sure whether that's the best way to win that battle. In my experience, if you talk to business people and you tell them, okay, maybe for you human rights are not so important. They're still in the Constitution, so as a country we've agreed on their importance, right? But you can think whatever you want. In democracy, you will get some forces in Switzerland, right, who think democracy is really important on your side. And rule of law is very fundamental for business people. They want to know their investment tomorrow is still there, right? The rule of law is really a business value, if you wish, also. So I think if we take this, it's easier not to frame the discussion so oppositional, right? And the second thing then is that the free trade agreement, and that's why I said I'm not so sure, right? And there's a free trade agreement in place. I'm not sure, but if we don't renegotiate it, it's not like we wouldn't fall back on before the first free trade agreement. The free trade agreement would have continued, right? So that I'm not sure whether that's the anchor point. If you write, what does it mean if you write human rights into the free trade agreement? I think there's an important element of that, which is symbolic towards the own population. But one should not be misled into thinking that, oh, then the PRC will change its behavior or something like that, right? They couldn't care less what's in this piece of paper, right? They know that you need the economy, that you need the market and all of that. So, and it's not just Switzerland. I think it's important in that regard. The Swiss position is a bit difficult because we're so in love with our neutrality and all of that. So we can always say, yeah, we're just neutral, right? But all the countries in Europe and beyond have chosen a path of compromise. Right? The European Union talks about principled pragmatism. Well, what is that? Pragmatic or both, right? It's nothing. It's basically a contradiction in terms. And Switzerland uses that too. Our foreign minister in newspaper report interviews will talk about a case evaluation, right? That's where you have principled pragmatism also. I think it's really important to get the bigger historical dimension and to see to what extent these societies have actually committed to being pragmatic about this. So there's the real tension, I think.
I understand, or I know that free trade agreements, they're only part of the whole puzzle, and I would like to zoom out now and look at more the political responsibility in everyday governance, including also institutional decisions like cultural funding or language programs. Before we continue, however, I would like to show you and the audience another video. This is the testimony of Karim Sharif, the first Uyghur refugee accepted in Switzerland. His story illustrates how transnational repression has followed him over 3 decades here in Switzerland.
Premier réfugié ouïghour accueilli par la Suisse. La Suisse m'a offert asile politique en 1990. Mais la Chine ne m'a jamais laissé tranquille. Depuis plus de 30 ans, le gouvernement chinois essaie soit de me séduire, soit de m'intimider. Durant les années qui ont suivi mon arrivée ici, plusieurs pièges m'ont été tendus pour que je sorte du territoire suisse, comme un colis envoyé par la famille que je devais aller chercher en Italie. Il y a déjà maintenant, il y a 2 millions de Ouïghours, ils sont dans le camp de concentration. Donc pour le Chinois, c'est une victoire s'il peut m'attraper, emmener en Chine. Et puis il dit voilà, l'ancien diplomate, et on a même tout le pouvoir. On peut le arrêter et m'emmener en Chine. Et après les autres, c'est juste pour donner un exemple. Parce qu'en Chine, on dit on tue une poule pour effrayer les singes. Des membres de ma famille ont ensuite été utilisés pour me transmettre en personne des messages visant soit à me faire revenir en Chine, soit à travailler pour le gouvernement chinois depuis la Suisse. Quand j'avais une position au sein du Congrès Ouïghour mondial, un NGO, le gouvernement chinois a tenté de m'engager pour que je leur transmette des informations sur les activités et les membres de cette organisation. Depuis que le média suisse s'intéresse de plus près à la situation des Ouïghours, que mon témoignage est apparu dans les journaux et à la télévision, le gouvernement chinois tente de m'intimider pour me faire taire. Leurs méthodes sont simples, mais efficaces. 3 feuilles de papier imprimées déposées dans ma boîte aux lettres, un drapeau chinois, une capture de l'écran de l'émission Temps présent et un document indiquant le nouveau nom que j'ai pris lors de ma naturalisation. Pas de menace explicite, pas de quoi déposer une plainte, mais un rappel du fait que je suis toujours surveillé. La Chine, ils ont une autre méthode pour faire souffrir les Ouïghours tibétains qui vivent en Occident, en Suisse. Ma mère, elle a 83 ans. Depuis 2017, il était interdit de répondre à mon téléphone. Et puis, le gouvernement l'a menacé, il ne faut pas répondre à son téléphone. Si il détecte on a une communication téléphonique, elle risque d'envoyer dans le camp de concentration en Chine. C'est une torture psychologique pour moi et pour les autres. Je m'appelle.
We've already talked about concrete examples, but with him we see the really long-term effects. And what does it show you, or what does it show, this testimony, what does it show us about this long-term reach of transnational repression? What maybe stands out to you most from his testimony? Maybe Selina.
I think it is a very scary example and a very extreme example of a long-term, of a life of repeated threats and encroachments on everyday life in Switzerland. On other relations, it's a very normal Swiss life, but you're still constantly concerned with thinking, what should I say, what shouldn't I say, how are the people back home, even though you also have to give up the contact, to stay in contact with them. It is on the individual life very, very hard, and you have to have a very strong character also to keep up fighting and not to kind of deal with this silencing and to still be outspoken and to do testimonies like that. That needs a lot of courage.
I think it only demonstrates that impunity will only make these behaviors, last longer and go on forever. So I think we need to break that, and I think it's good that the governments, that's the Swiss government, is trying to look into this phenomenon, and not only look into it, but also trying to find solutions together with the affected communities. So I think accountability matters, not only for the victims, but also others who are also watching, because you don't know, you can be non-Uyghur, non-Tibetan and still be impacted by transnational repression tomorrow from China or other governments. So it's something that that we need to address, impunity.
Now I'd like to briefly return to the video we opened with. You may recall at the beginning of this event, we saw footage of a young woman being pushed to the ground at the Basel Moon Festival. And in this follow-up clip, she shares her experience.
Mein Name ist Migmar Dolma, ich bin Autorin, ich bin Tibeterin und Schweizerin. Und ich war betroffen von transnationaler Repression. Meine Großeltern sind damals aus Tibet geflüchtet, wo China Tibet besetzt hat. Meine Eltern sind in die Schweiz gekommen. Und da bin ich vor allem in meiner Jugend sehr aktiv für ein freies Tibet. Vor 10 Jahren am Basler Mondfest 2014 haben wir mit ein paar jungen Aktivisten, Aktivistinnen vom Tibeter Jugendverein während der Ansprache der chinesischen Botschafterin einen stillen Protest machen. Und wir haben unsere Slogans dabei gehabt, Stop the Chinese Propaganda und China soll aufhören, tibetische Kultur zu zerstören. Und wo sie geredet hat, sind wir dann aufgestanden, aber also ruhig aufgestanden und haben das einfach in die Höhe heben. Und ich bin in der vorderen Reihe und ich habe eigentlich gar nicht geschafft, das aufzuheben. Und bin wirklich so angegriffen worden von einer Person, die ausgesehen hat wie ein Chines. Und er hat mich dann am Boden abgedrückt und ich habe gar nicht gewusst, was passiert. Also es ist so, halt physisch irgendwie hat er mich übermannt. Und dann habe ich hochgeschaut und habe gemerkt, das muss irgendwie eine Person sein, die in Beziehung steht zu dieser Botschafterin. Und dann habe ich wie so gemischt aus Angst und Wut. Und dann habe ich ihn angeschaut und gesagt, this is not China, this is Switzerland. Also du kannst meine Meinungsfreiheit und meine Rechte da nicht einschränken, oder? Und dann hat er mich wie festgehabt und dann wie plötzlich losgelassen. Also wie, es war auch für ihn, glaube ich, wie eine Situation, wo er wieder realisiert hat, wo er sich überhaupt befindet und was er gerade macht in der Öffentlichkeit. Und nachher haben wir einfach still eigentlich Faust in die Luft gehabt, so, um zu zeigen, wir lassen uns nicht einschüchtern. Und dann hat Guy Morin, der damalige Basler Stadtpräsident, hat dann das Wort erhoben und hat ergriffen und hat dann gesagt, das ist ein Fest für Kinder und Familien. Ich bitte euch, das zu respektieren, und wir haben euch damals als Gäste hier empfangen und jetzt möchten wir bitten, dass ihr unser Fest auch respektiert. Und das ist eigentlich für mich persönlich der viel schlimmere Moment gewesen, weil ich gedacht habe, das ist ein gewählter Schweizer Politiker, sogar noch von der Grünen Partei. Wir sind Schweizer Bürgerinnen und so in der eigenen Recht auch entwürdigt zu werden und eigentlich zu hören von der Bühne, nachdem so etwas Schlimmes passiert ist, dass man dort überhaupt, also weder Schutz noch irgendwelche, dass man eigentlich gar nicht als Bürger von dem Land anerkannt wird. Das ist eigentlich fast schlimmer gewesen als die physische Aktion von dem chinesischen Botschaftspersonal. Also von der Schweiz würde ich mir erhoffen, dass sie sich mutig zeigt und ihre Außenpolitik die Werte auch lebt, wo sie vorgibt. Und ich denke, die Schweiz war das erste europäische Land, das die Tibeter damals aufgenommen hat. Viele Tibeter haben während vielen Jahrzehnten in den Fabriken gearbeitet. Man hat sie gebraucht auch als Arbeitskraft. Und zu sehen, dass man wirklich für wirtschaftlichen Profit und um sich ein bisschen der Weltmacht China ein bisschen anbiedern, dass man sogar das Recht der eigenen Bürger verletzt. Ich denke, das ist wirklich etwas, das der Demokratie und allen Werten, die die Schweiz vorgibt, das Leben nicht gerecht wird.
So she shares that the way the city, among other things, the city president responded hurt her even more than the confrontation itself. Ralph Weber, how should he have responded to an incident like that? Or more generally, how should Swiss authorities and Swiss society respond to cases like this?
Well, difficult question. I think the speech that she rehearses, he has been giving afterwards, right? Of course, that wasn't very well taken. Right, but I also would think that a lot of Swiss politicians are not well prepared for such a moment, right? So, bon, it was what it was. It wasn't very helpful, right? I think he probably would realize too. The question that this scene shows in Basel, I think, is another one also. I mean, it's the reaction by that politician, but the scene when she's pressed down, right? I mean, there's a lot of issues that go with that. And the first and foremost one is international sovereignty. Right? The protection of a foreign ambassador is the duty of the Swiss government to do, not of embassy people or other people around. Right? So there's something really going wrong in that moment, I think. There's no place in Switzerland for actors just to step up and press others to the ground, right? And not in the name of protecting the ambassador who's on stage. That is the duty of the Swiss police, basically. Right? So there's really something going wrong there. And I think that scene, how should I put it, deserves much more discussion and more investigation, I would think, right? But also more broadly, how should government react? I think it depends in which place in government you sit. You have different functions, and sometimes that's harder to navigate, right? So if you talk to a Swiss ambassador in Beijing, we'll have a very different environment to move around, right? And probably sometimes has to compromise because that's what an ambassador, by definition, almost has to do, right? But how to interact? One thing that I would like to mention is if you think how across these 20, 30 years historically, and this sort of warming up with China, how that has translated visually. How many images have you seen in TV of state representatives going to China, meeting Xi Jinping, and you think probably they're playing poker afterwards or smoking a cigar because they're so friendly with each other. Emmanuel Macron is a specialist in that, right? But also Swiss politicians. So if a federal councillor goes there, one wonders why does it become a habit to smile into the cameras, to show your friendship in this way with a person whom we, in terms of values, don't share so much other than the economic interest, right? So that I think might seem like a little detail, but transfer you into the position of somebody in Switzerland who thinks that that same government is going like transnational repression after you. And then you see in TV the person that represents the government who you have the right and hope that it would protect you from that transnational repression, hugging Xi Jinping. Right? So if one does that little game in one's head, and it's not a game for everyone, right? But it is, we can imagine it that way. I think it brings home the message of importance of symbols, right? Of visuals and all of that. And that is a very small little thing governments can do. And just one more comment, because I was trying to allude to that before. We can have long discussions about how you can prevent the PRC of doing transnational repression, right? And sometimes I think good luck with that. Because it's a very powerful actor, and they will find just new ways of going after you. You do a law here, they will do something there, right? It's powerful and it's very flexible and adaptive. But it's still important to have that discussion. But it's equally important to think about one's own government and how it behaves. I think in the last 20, 30 years, the Swiss government has probably lost a bit of a trust relationship with the communities, right? Through not taking these things seriously, through the way that demonstrations in Bern have been handled and other things, right? So, and that is something very easy to change, right? You can change things in Switzerland much easier. And that's why also, you know, when we say, and I think it's right, it is remarkable that the Swiss government has written the report now the way it has, and I didn't feel it has beautified or changed around the research result. I felt that it was quite honestly what was written in the research report, and everybody can check, right? But it didn't do so because it thought that's a good idea, right? It was a specialty of our political system that made that work. So civil society actors have put pressure, have mobilized. Parliament has transferred that to the government, and the government could not but had to do that, right? I think if they had a chance, probably many over there would have had a more quiet life if it didn't happen, right? We have to explain that to the Chinese side and so on and so forth. So it's a hassle for many people there. But it's civil society and it's the political system in Switzerland that allows for such things. And I think that's where maybe a lot of the force, if you're I'm not an activist, I'm an academic, right? But if I were an activist, that's where I put, I think, my focus on.
And I think I just want to say that this is, just want to raise my hands and applaud to all of the activists and human rights defenders, organizations that put all the work behind, because I think it really takes, as someone said earlier, a lot of courage to do this work, because you're constantly confronted to challenges, and not a day goes by without thinking that you're harassed, you're monitored, you're surveilled, your family members will, live the consequences of your actions. So really, thank you for those who stood up, took this in their own hands, including civil society organizations, community members, but also academics who, said, yes, let's research this. Because without that, we don't have much to go in front of policymakers and government officials. So thanks to everyone who contributed.
The Society for Threatened People Switzerland is one of those organizations who, together with communities, have raised these concerns and have fought against repression in Switzerland and elsewhere, and your organization also called for a government investigation even back in 2018. How do you now assess the Federal Council's response now that the report is published?
Yeah, first, we are happy that it is finally out. It took a while. It was delayed, and we are happy that the government report and much more the external study confirms what we already tried to collect in the report back in 2018. But when it comes to the measures, we think that the report of the Federal Council is rather weak. It speaks, for example, of the need to clarify the needs that are there now, and they need to talk about who is in charge. And we're just very afraid that is now a tactic to prolong again the process, and we think the study is there, the results are already a bit older because the report was delayed, and there are even more cases out that we need to act now. We need to now have measures to protect the victims of transnational repressions. And the political will would be there. I mean, the Foreign Policy Commission of the National Council, they asked the Federal Council to also take even before the report was out, to take the findings of the report and of the study into, for example, negotiating in the negotiations of the free trade agreement. So the political will, I think, would be there. Where it lacks is a bit courage. And we really hope that the government finds it. And we think what is very important, for example, is also that the government meets also or includes the diasporas, the communities, Tibetan and Uyghur communities, because they are really the best to talk about it and to also develop the best practices to fight transnational repression.
And do the communities have these measures or the announcements of these measures, have they reached the communities, and what is the reaction of the communities themselves? Do you have any insight into that?
Well, I think the results, the report is it's not something you read on your free day. It is long, it is complicated. I think a lot of the people, Tibetan and Uyghur people living in Switzerland, they work a 100% job. They have families, they have hobbies. So it's not an easy thing to go through the report and to understand also what does it mean now for my life, how does it translate. But actually we try to also, with our Tibetan and Uyghur partners, to bring the report into the communities more, and also then to spill back what the communities think is needed. So we try to start this process, and we did that actually today, earlier in the morning, and we will continue that. Yeah.
I just have one additional question, Ralph Weber. Are there also any signs, or how should Swiss authorities interpret the role of Chinese-linked associations and consular staff, for example, in the broader picture of repression? Are there, for example, signs of soft power efforts, like cultural diplomacy or academic ties that are being used in more covert ways than those that were identified, for example, in the study?
Yeah, I think it's important not to mix too much together there, right? And it's important, I think, in our findings, we didn't come across diaspora, Han Chinese diaspora organizations in Switzerland that would play a major role when it comes to transnational repression. Usually transnational repression is a task that the public security bureaus are involved, the intelligence services, Ministry of State Security, Ministry of Public Security is involved in. Some United Front related organizations in Tibet and Xinjiang are involved in, right? And then the embassy and the consulate, right, knows about it. But it's not that the Han Chinese associations played a major role in this. And that's why I introduced at the beginning this term of transgressive political activities. That's where other things happening in Switzerland, where these associations sometimes are involved. Although in a study that I published in 2020, when I looked at that, I still would claim that the more important leverage actually goes through cooptation of Swiss political, economic, media elites, right, rather than the diaspora. Because one has to be careful in not framing this in a way that would in any way enforce xenophobic or racist tendencies against Han Chinese, who for very different reasons are in Switzerland. Some want to study, right, others want to do this. And one must be careful in not casting a general suspicion towards that part of the population. Sometimes I even think, from the outside at least, that there are so many Han Chinese people who probably live with the same sort of fears. I've heard it from Han Chinese, you know, my family is back home in China. So like similar things, right, that sometimes there might be even openings in that regard, which does not mean that the party state is not very active in Switzerland, and so one must be, it's a tight walk, right, and I must be careful in navigating and in using the right words to describe all of that. Now there's enough to answer your question of soft power, of propaganda efforts, and also beyond, and one should not forget propaganda is legal. It's not illegal, right? Some of you might have a little poster of Xi Jinping at home and burn incense every evening. All fine, you can do that. That's what a liberal democracy allows for, right? And propaganda is something that is to a large extent legal. So we need to find a way in a liberal democracy to confront that. One thing you can do is you can talk about it. As much as it is legal to do it, it is legal to point towards it, right? But then one must be careful in not trying to legally make sure that no propaganda is... One starts being authoritarian oneself, right? And then there's a sort of a spectrum on which other things are less legal, more problematic, right? When it comes to illegal knowledge transfer, things like that. And so there's a range of phenomena, and one must be really careful in not putting everything into the same bucket then, right? So that I think I would want to say about this. Yeah.
I still want to talk a little bit more about the soft power aspect of it and involve the other guests as well, because there are diaspora members that have raised concerns that China's soft power influence may also affect cultural support, for example, in Switzerland. So one example is the discontinuation of the Tibetan language courses at the University of Bern, seen by some as a sign of declining institutional support for politically sensitive cultures. Sering Tomo, how do you assess, for example, this development?
Well, I mean, I don't know how to put this in the strongest terms, because this is so disappointing, to say the least, because just early this month, we received information about one of the worst forms of transnational repression, which is extrajudicial killings. And last month, on 29th of March, a widely respected Tibetan religious leader and educator, also a philanthropist. He's highly revered in Tibet. He disappeared last November, and then he apparently, fled to Vietnam in Southeast Asia. And then on 27th of March, in a joint operation involving 5 Vietnamese police and 5 Chinese security services officers, they detained Trugu. His name is Trugu Hungar Dorje Rinpoche. So he was detained, and on 29th of March, within less than 2 days, he died in Chinese and Vietnamese joint custody. And he was just 56 years old, healthy man with excellent health. And now we still have not received his body. Apparently, the Chinese authorities have invited, I'm telling this story because this is directly relevant to cultural rights, because this religious leader, he is respected, partly because he was responsible for building, schools, Tibetan language schools inside Tibet, especially in Golok, Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture, which is in, Qinghai province. So in the rest of Tibet, we have Tibet Autonomous Region, and then there are other Tibetan areas in Sichuan province. All over Tibet, what we have seen in the last several years is that the Chinese authorities have closed down all Tibetan language schools. And now Tibetan children are forced to learn Mandarin language. And the medium of instruction in Tibetan schools are all Chinese. And now we have this religious leader who had built schools for Tibetan students so that they can learn their own language. And he was killed last month, and we are still calling for investigation from the Vietnamese authorities, but there has been no development so far, no favorable development. So this is what has happened. We look towards international community. We believe that we come into exile, at least we'll have some space to preserve our language, our culture, our traditions. And now that is also being taken away in the most violent ways. Our leaders are killed just because they try to preserve their language. So I guess that says a lot, this direct relation between transnational repression and the way these advocates of Tibetan language are basically assassinated in foreign country.
Ralph Weber, you spoke about cultural centers, I think yesterday or the day before, in the Berner Zeitung, and how these are used to exert influence. Could you maybe react maybe to this and add what these cultural centers could possibly be mean in relation to that?
Mm. Yeah, maybe it's a good point to emphasize that, of course, coming from the university, I must look at things a bit differently, right? And I have my own way of doing that, is that I speak out publicly about something when I have found evidence to do that. And that's my grade, right? So on the burn issue, I think you're right. It's unfortunate in terms of visibility, all of that. But I was shy in saying, the university is doing this on purpose or has been in the pockets of the party. There's no evidence for any of that I've seen personally, right? But it is highly unfortunate for the reasons you pointed out, I think. Right, with the Chinese Cultural Center that has opened or is about to open just in Bern, right? It's a different story, because that one has been announced by the Chinese ambassador 5 years ago. It was always said, we will build that, right? So the connection was never hidden, right? It was always clear this is something done by the embassy. Now that you would find easily. And then I went a bit more into that, and I looked at Chinese language sources on this, and I found the entity that is responsible for these cultural centers. They exist in the 1980s, many countries. Paris was an early one, Copenhagen was another one. It's one per country. right? And on that homepage, you find actually the Bern Center explicitly mentioned, right? And if you go to the About Us section, right, and it says what they're for, and it says in Chinese that they're for soft power, right? So it's very clear, and in that sense, you know, it's important, I think, to understand in the Chinese party environment, these things are not hidden. It's just a misconception if we think of United Front as a sort of a secretive sort of. Often in Chinese, it's an open book, and you often find these sort of sources. The question or the problem is we don't look, and we have few people who do, right? And sometimes I think I could spend 20 lives doing just that, right? And even that would be too little, because there's too much information, not too little. And then just to end the story on Bern, and maybe it's important for the audience to understand how one comes to say something in the newspapers, because there's afterwards backlash. You know, the so-called expert said something, right? So it's important to understand how that works. Then I found the 2023 party journal having an article on these cultural centers. And that was even more beautiful, because there it was written in there explicitly that these centers are there to bring subtly the spirit of Xi Jinping 20th Party Congress into these societies. Right? It was said that it is about the cooptation of sinologists, and they don't mean the sinologists at universities. What is meant is anybody who is good enough to go into Chinese TV and say something nice about China and being a Westerner is immediately declared a sinologist. Right? But to co-opt artists and other useful assets, it says in the language there, and it even ends this by saying, you know, like it's important to take, it's like taking a boat to go to the sea, which is a very old United Front tactic of it's better to have the message delivered by a foreigner than by somebody from China itself. So all of that is there in the written, and that's what I contributed to this discussion on the cultural center. Now it's up for people to make up what they think of it. It's an academic, it's not my role to tell the people what they should think, right? I see myself as giving this information, and then people can decide what they think of it. But it's a very different sort of case than the university one, I think, because universities are different structures, right? They prepare those things. There's all sorts of considerations. And I don't want to say that universities are immune against any sort of this influence. They're not usually, right? But my point is we should always try to show evidence, right, before we hypothesize about something. Yeah.
If I can just add one quick thing, another angle to this is also we've observed over the last few years, as you know, these mass human rights abuses are happening in our countries. The use of some certain diaspora Chinese associations in countries like Australia, Canada, US, even in France, where they actually dress up Chinese individuals who dress up as Uyghurs in our traditional clothing, or as Tibetans, and they go to these national parades disguised as, you know, claiming that this is a Chinese part of the Chinese culture, that this is not Uyghur, but it belongs to the Chinese heritage and culture and traditions, and they celebrate it. And it just baffles me, because in one hand, they're trying to erase everything about our culture in our country, our dress, you know, codes, our traditional clothing, and our dances, our traditions. And in the other hand, they're just using that culture to say it's theirs. And it's just really, I think, I think it's just the behavior of a colonizer, basically. And I think this is something that we've observed increase over the last few years as the Chinese propaganda, you know, increased as well at the same time. And it's something that we have, at least the World Uyghur Congress and our community has been very vocal about. It's something that still occurs in Australia, for example.
Thank you very much for those insights. I would now like to open the floor to questions from the audience. My coworker Stephanie has the mic. Yeah, she will come to you. Yes.
No worries. Attendez, je parle le français, c'est pour ça. J'ai préparé quelque chose. Ça va être difficile. Mais ce que je voulais dire, tout d'abord, merci à tous les intervenants. Thank you to the speakers. And thank you for the organizers. In your introduction, you speak about Xinjiang and minorities. Please, I know it's not bad and with a bad intention, but Xinjiang, we Tibetan, I have many Uyghur friends, and we are with them. We are fighting against the terminology of Chinese terminology, and Xinjiang it's a Chinese name. Please call Turkestan Oriental or Oriental Turkestan minority. We are not minority of China. We are people, threatened people, persecuted people by China. And I'm here as to represent an association who called France Tibet, and they told me, please get to represent us. And I say, the round table is with English speaking, and I say, so I have prepared something in English. It's a little testimony. It's very important.
Shortly, so we can have some more questions, please.
Okay.
Just a very short statement. Then we go to other questions. Okay. I think it looks a little bit long. Maybe we can share it afterwards at the apéro. Is it okay? Just one sentence, please.
Okay. I say, I give you...
Later you can give it, yes.
Yeah, okay. Because I have, think, maybe Professor, you can take my testimony and to read my testimony, but we have no time. Okay. Shortly to say, sorry for my, my English, but my testimony is to say, sometimes there are complicity with state and some states and the transnational repression of China. I take maybe two examples. The first one, Tsirin Somola has already said, because of complicity of Vietnam state with China to kill our Hunkar Dorje Rinpoche. The second complicity, I say, I know very well, I earned my life in France, and I know I was depuis longtemps, since a long time, thank you. Since a long time, as an observer of Franco-China Tibetan relationships. And I know well French. I know well not the question, was testimony, some collaboration or to say complicity, French state with China Republic policy.
Yes.
Okay. Not
so,
please.
Two words.
One patience.
No, we will have some other questions, please.
Because there are some French TV, France 2, has reporter, make a reporter about, the title is China is policing in France. There are near Paris, police officer of Chinese police officer. And I heard sometime speaking about soft power of China. This time it's finished. Now time is repression with systematic violence.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
The problem is we have a lot of voices we want to hear, and we would love to hear your testimony afterwards at the apéro. So thank you very much for sharing this. If there is another question, please be brief so that we can talk to more people.
You go first here, and then I.
Yeah, so I'll hold it.
Stephanie's going to hold the microphone.
Okay, whoa,
yeah.
okay. Yes, so I won't say anything, hello, all these things. I'll just, because I want to thank my friend here, Willie, who actually told me about this. I didn't know anything about this. So I just, there are things, I'm an activist, you all know that I'm an activist, but I never call myself as an activist. I always, since now almost 35 years, I've been here in Switzerland. I'm trying to teach the Swiss government and the Swiss people that don't trust Chinese from the very beginning, from 35 years ago, ever since I've been here. So now, there is a couple of things that I want to just quickly read, which I wrote down. So, I just, okay, fine. Okay, it's about the travel document. I'm Tibetan, and I hold the blue travel document. And from the time 2013, the trade agreement, I am made a Chinese by the Swiss government, because Swiss government was ordered by the Chinese government, Xi Jinping, and told that all the people who hold this blue travel document, Tibetans, are to be Chinese. So I travel as a musician all over the world, and every time they tell me, are you Chinese? And I have to explain them, no, I'm not Chinese, I'm Tibetan, but the Swiss government, just as a Jew will be called as a Nazi, I'm called a Chinese. And then, sorry.
1 second, and then we go to the next.
My God, okay, fine. I'm not trying to force you anything, but this is very important because you talk about real experiences. My son and my Nima, my daughter Nima, they're my children, but they are Swiss. Their mother is Swiss. And now what I want to say here is that just before the COVID, my children wanted to go to Tibet. My ex-wife and her boyfriend, they all wanted to go. And they went to the Chinese embassy for visa. And you know what? They are Swiss. My children are Swiss. And the moment the Chinese consulate asked them, oh, you have a Tibetan name. Why do you have a Tibetan name? And my daughter and my son, they're very proud of me. And they said, our father's name is Loten Namling. And the consulate there in the Chinese embassy said, what? What did you say? I said, my daughter proudly said, that our father is Loten Namling. And then at once refused visa. Thousands and millions of Chinese can come to Switzerland free. And a Swiss cannot go to Tibet. This is another thing.
Thank you.
I have more, but you're talking about more the experiences.
Yes, we can talk about them at the apéro. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. It's just hear more voices. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to inform you that at the National Federal Parliament in Bern, there is, in the National Council, a motion by the Commission of Foreign Policy dated March 2025, which will be handled in at the June session, most probably this year. This motion requests from the Swiss government, the Federal Council, to take measures, including legal measures, maybe under criminal law, to protect foreign diasporas, like the Tibetans, the Uighurs, and I'm also talking about the Falun Gong people who are also harassed in Switzerland, and to protect them against those acts of persecution by the Chinese government. And this information is just to tell you that, but I want to add that something which is very important, what the federal government should do. It's very easy to tell the Chinese on the purely political level, what you are doing in Switzerland, this is a violation of the principle of non-immixtion, non-interference in our national law, national affairs. But so it's only a matter of civil courage to say so, you know. Yeah. But are they doing it? I wonder.
The Chinese government is always not shy to remind people that Uyghur rights, Tibetan rights are the affairs of the Chinese government. So why not the Western governments do the same?
Okay.
Hello, I would like to first, I'd like to first say thank you for everyone for coming here, and I don't want my question to be taken the wrong way, so I first want to obviously make clear I understand what you guys are saying. I've never suffered under the same circumstance. I've never had my family members threatened, none of that, but you're putting a lot of pressure on the soft power aspect, and I eat Chinese soft power for breakfast, lunch, and dinner because I'm learning Chinese. So obviously I'm on Douyin, I'm on Weixin, I'm on Xiaohongshu, I'm on all these apps. And obviously, I get to see the Chinese perspective on all these issues, right? For example, you mentioned Falun Gong. I know Li Hongxi, the leader of Falun Gong, is not a good person, right? He's not banned from China for no reason. Their members set themselves aflame, right? And I also want to ask in this sense, because I know they're like, for example, there's Uyghur groups who are associated to Al-Qaeda and who are fighting in Syria. I'm just asking a question, right? If you don't want questions to be asked, you can go to a dictatorship. So my question is, I see how they're going right now is obviously too far. They're harassing people. But my question is, in what frame do you think can the Chinese government, they won't do it, it's just I'm asking, act to protect themselves from potential dangers that they say are active, like they say they're extremist groups. So what should they do without hurting innocent people or without suppressing people? That's my question.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for that. I mean, it's not just the Chinese government's task to protect itself from acts of terrorism, right? It's the responsibility of the international community. And as we've seen, Uyghurs were never accused of being terrorists. That only happened after 9/11, after the international war on terror started. Because before that, the narrative was Uyghurs are separatists. Because we had our independent states twice in history, and because of that, we were framed as separatists or thieves or backward people, uneducated, poor people, but never of terrorism. 9/11 happened, suddenly they co-opted the war on terror and said Uyghurs are terrorists. Why? Because it's easier to actually buy the support from the international community at that time. And since then, that stuck. But how is it okay for the Swiss government? Are you Swiss? Yeah. Is it okay for the Swiss government if someone here outside, let's say, acts, does a terrorist act here, a bombing, and then calls it, jihad and stuff, and puts it on Islam? Is it okay that all of us here are punished for his act? That's exactly what the Chinese government is doing. Putting over 3 million of people, Uyghurs and Turkic people of Muslim origin, in concentration internment camps since 2017, disappearing our family members, because we're all blamed for the acts, isolated acts, incidents of a few people. So I think that's what you need to remember when you actually talk about it in that framework. And it's a very prevalent narrative in Chinese social media and also in Chinese misinformation, disinformation campaigns. But I think there's this need to kind of put things in perspective and remember that the act of a few doesn't, define everyone, the collective.
Thank you very much. We're going to take one more question from the YouTube chat so that the people who watch online are also included. Stephanie?
Yeah, thank you. I just pick one question concerning the communities. There's a question: do you see social media as a valuable option to advocate anonymously and to create an online community where trust and in real life communities is lost. So kind of like to build the trust online instead of within the community. Yeah, now it's working again. So question is if there would be an option that, as there is sometimes shrinking trust in the diaspora communities, if a social media group or online community could kind of restore this trust. Do you have any experience with that? Yeah, restore or build trust in the communities abroad.
I think it goes both ways. It's difficult to say. Yes, we have seen, people in our community using social media to restore that trust, but at the same time, it has, gone the other way. Because it has actually encouraged, some people to actually misuse social media as a tool, pretending to be this, sympathizer, and then, pretending to be a supporter, and then trying to actually, surveil that person, trying to create trust, and then building that rapport. But, ultimately, that's not the person you think that person is. So it goes both ways, yeah.
Thank you very much. Before we wrap up, and as we said, we have the opportunity to continue discussions afterwards at the apéro, but I have one final question for our panelists. For you, what is now the most important thing that needs to happen next to better protect those affected by transnational repression in Switzerland? Maybe we start with Ralph Weber. Because it's a hard question.
Yeah, since it's an easy question, yeah. If I knew, I think that from my point of view, there's still a lot to be done to understand much better the phenomenon, right? To understand much better the mechanisms that the party state uses to do that. That's where the academic interest comes from, right? Then there's, I think what needs to be done on the basis of a better understanding, and hopefully that report contributed a little bit to that, right, is what should be done in a liberal democracy. There should be an open discussion with all kinds of questions, right? I think that the young man was right. He can ask whatever he wants, and I hope he will be afterwards still around so we can talk to each other, right? But exactly, and people should learn Chinese, by the way. It's the completely wrong conclusion to think because of all that. We need more people who speak Chinese, not less, right? I would love to have more people who speak fluently Chinese to help me do the research, right? So that's all good. So, and on that basis, I think a broad discussion, an honest discussion, and if you want it in very simple terms, I think what we would need is an honest gaze into the mirror, in a sense, and see, okay, we have these rights, these values in the Constitution. How do we as a society arrange that? Economic interests are also in the Constitution, right? Welfare and all of that. So it's not an easy thing that one tries to do. And so whoever has an easy solution, good for you, right? But still, to have not a discussion about it, to get used to not actually balancing out those things, but always choosing one side, or mostly choosing one side, sometimes symbolically referring to human rights and democracy when it doesn't hurt so much, right? It's not, I think, how one should go about it. So this honest gaze into the mirror is something that is easily be done. And for whatever concerns the party state, I think liberal democracy did good in exposing it, in addressing it, right? But see to it that one doesn't get into a sort of, yellow threat motive, in a sort of yellow peril, right? Motive, things in history that we can't be proud of, or like in modern forms of racism or xenophobia. I don't think that's good for a liberal democracy. So we need to find a good balancing act also in language. And sometimes I think we lack language right, to describe all of that in the most precise way. And it's really, might sound academic to you, but I do think it's important. Yeah.
Thank you. Selina?
I think what is now, what we need to do now, I mean, I like that we're so close from the Bundeshaus, so I think the next step is really gonna happen with community, with politics, to press for measures that protect those affected. And you had a few weeks or months ago an event on transnational repression in the Eritrean community, if I'm not wrong. And so it is really a thing that affects not only Tibetan and Uyghur people. it is done by authoritarian regimes all over the world, and it is really important that we come together, that we learn from each other, and then it is gonna hopefully change to the better.
Thank you. Zering?
Yeah, what you are asking is really a huge question. So, but I'll say three things. First is I cannot emphasize enough the importance of awareness raising amongst the authorities and the departments, relevant departments, like the law enforcement, the secret services, and the foreign ministry and home affairs as well. That is really important. Secondly, I would like to say respectfully to the Swiss government that yes, you can have trading relationship with China, that's okay, but at the same time, you can be critical of the human rights violations. I mean, why does it have to be a zero-sum game? Because these are your values, your principles. This is who you are. Don't give your power away. This is not who you are. You are not just looking for profits, right? You are just more than that. Take pride in that. So, and thirdly, I think we just watched a testimony from a young Tibetan woman, activist. So she is a Swiss citizen, right? So she was talking about how, as a citizen, her rights were violated. I would like to stress here, in connection with transnational repression, that the impacts of transnational repression are not just felt or experienced by Tibetans who are citizens, but also there are many other Tibetans who just enjoy temporary protections as refugees in this country. So some are permanent residents, not citizens. There are others who still have no papers. They are undocumented. They also need protection. They are also impacted by transnational repression. Thank you.
I think it's the question of the hour. There are a lot of things to be said about what needs to be done now, but I think there's a lot to say about collective resilience, and it's something that we've been doing a lot with our own community, whether it's in Germany or in Switzerland or elsewhere. But I think for us, resilience is not a choice. We didn't choose to suddenly become resilient, right? It's kind of imposed, or you don't have a choice. So I think we need to be resilient, but also being resilient means that you have a lot of trauma that you're carrying with you all the time. So what are the tools that are available to the community members in terms of mental health, in terms of legal resources, legal protection, for example, asylum seekers, for them to get that protection, and also awareness, because I think from my own experience, I've witnessed many Uyghurs in my community who, yes, they know this is an act of transnational repression, but it's become such a normalized phenomenon that they don't even report it. But I think for us, it's incredibly important to document every single thing, even small incidents, even if it's just a small attack on your email, hacking, or slander campaigns, deepfakes. You need to collect that evidence, because you're going to use it to report at some point. And I think also the other thing is, as a whole society and governments, we need to be adaptive, because as Professor Weber said earlier, the Chinese government is quickly changing methods. Now with the AI is not fully regulated anywhere. So with the AI, I was victim of deepfake just a couple of months ago. And how do we protect citizens like us who, with all of the new emerging technology? So I think this is one thing. And the last thing that I would really urge everyone is, and again, thank you so much for coming in such numbers, because solidarity matters. It's because as people who are going through, again, all of these difficulties, to see that you're listening and you're here with us hand in hand, it means we're not alone, and that there's hope at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you. Yes, so on behalf of the Politforum Bern, but also of the Society of Threatened Peoples Switzerland, I'd like to thank all of you. I have a little present for you afterwards. And I also would like to thank all of you for coming. It is great that you came in such great numbers. So thank you very much. And as I already announced, you are also warmly invited to our apéro, where we can continue our discussion. So the apéro is right downstairs on the 3rd floor, so you can just go downstairs. Our colleagues will wait there for you. So thank you very much, and yeah, have a pleasant evening. Thank you. Yeah.